So, good afternoon, Your Majesty, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this EPC policy dialogue on why do the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals matter more than ever. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and I have the privilege of moderating our discussion, and I am extremely honoured to welcome our speakers this afternoon, Her Majesty, the Queen of the Belgians and a United Nations SDG advocate, Jutta Urpilainen, the European Commissioner for International Partnerships, and Guillaume Lafortune, Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network in the Paris office. And we're going to discuss this afternoon the state of play in meeting the 17 goals, which are at the core of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, consider the impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had on efforts to reach those goals, amid warnings from the United Nations Development Programme that global human development, a combination of education, health, living standards, could fall for the first time this year since 1990, when measurements began. And we'll discuss the key challenges that lie ahead to repair the damage done by the pandemic and put the world on track to meet the goals. We're going to have a series of short introductory speeches by our distinguished speakers, then some questions from me to them. Also an opportunity for you, if you would write your questions, please use the Q&A box, write your questions. We don't have much time today, so we're going to save time by having written questions only. And please keep them brief so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. So Q&A button, if you would like to tweet out to the world what you are hearing at this event, and we do encourage you to get the Sustainable Development Goals message out, please use the hashtag Global Goals. So without further ado, it is my privilege and honour to welcome Her Majesty, the Queen of the Belgians, and to give you the floor for your opening speech. Your Majesty, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, almost 6 years ago, the international community unanimously adopted a roadmap to a more sustainable future. Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were born out of a shared perception. We needed a new definition of progress. Business as usual was no longer an option. Major economic, social, and ecological imbalances were taking us down a dangerous path. The SDGs helped us connect the dots: climate change and poverty, biodiversity and human well-being, depletion of natural resources and instability, governance and inequalities are all related, and they all need urgent and equal attention. This new UN agenda was designed to be truly universal. It underlined the interdependence between North and South, between prosperous and poor, between people and planet. It also sought to complement and multiply the impact of official efforts by encouraging innovative partnerships with the private sector, academia, and civil society. Awareness of the SDGs grew. They were embraced by many stakeholders: international institutions, governments, business, citizens, think tanks, and philanthropic organizations. They gained in support and in credibility. They became a reference in sustainability reports, in policy papers, and in academic research. Unfortunately, real action for their implementation remained uneven and sometimes sluggish. We fell behind in fighting climate change. Inequalities grew further. Hunger rose again. The world was definitely off track. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres raised the alarm, and the UN launched a decade of action for the SDGs. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused immense suffering. Millions of lives have been cut short. Many will bear the consequences of physical and mental trauma for years. Around the globe, jobs and incomes have been lost. Schools have closed for months at a time. Domestic violence has risen to unprecedented levels. COVID-19 has disproportionately hit the most vulnerable. It has also shed a harsh light on how inequalities and social injustice pervade even the most prosperous societies. The pandemic has affected us all, one way or another. But it has also demonstrated vividly how we are all connected, how we are responsible for each other, how one's actions affect others, how inaction in one part of the world can have dramatic consequences on the other side of the globe, not only for now, but also for the future. As we move toward recovery, we might be tempted to recreate the world as we knew it, to resume our way of life. However, we are now better equipped to grasp the need of change, to reason and act differently, to plan for the future, to pay more attention to and deal more swiftly with alerts, to be mindful of the longer-term consequences of our choices and actions, to build our own resilience as interdependent societies and people, to leave no one behind, and moreover, to do no harm along the way. Interconnectedness, future-oriented action, and shared resilience are at the heart of the SDGs. As we embark on rebuilding and on building better for the future, we are lucky to have at our disposal this readily available guide for a coherent transition and transformation. We should rely on the SDGs to the full extent of their potential. Obviously, they are a precious accounting and monitoring mechanism for registering and comparing progress. They are also a well-thought-out toolbox to help us to move ahead on all fronts. More importantly so, they present us with a reasoned and coherent picture of the future we are trying to achieve. For this, they need to be fully embraced by all stakeholders. The European Green Deal has clearly shown the way in this regard. Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, as has often been stated, this crisis offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to fundamentally rethink our economies and our societies. Fortunately, the groundwork laid down at the United Nations some years ago remains ever more relevant. It is available to all those who want and need to work on the transformation that will secure a sustainable future for all. This opportunity should not be missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Majesty. So underlining there just how important the SDGs were before COVID, but now just how much we need, as you said, to use them to build better for the future, to seize that once in a generation opportunity. And you outlined there some of the ways in which you believe that can be done. Lots to come back to in our discussion. Thank you so much for now. Commissioner, your opening thoughts, please.
Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be here to discuss this critical issue. When the 2030 agenda was adopted in 2015, we knew the challenge was huge, but we felt collectively that we could together make it reality. Now the COVID-19 crisis has set back progress in implementing the SDGs, and even worse, has generally set back progress for the most vulnerable countries. So yes, the UN Sustainable Development Goals still matter. Let me make 3 points in this regard. First of all, for the EU, the Sustainable Development Goals are the compass in charting a sustainable path out of the current crisis. The SDGs lie at the heart of our policy making, both internally but also externally. Within the EU, we are working on deeply transformative policies that are addressing specific SDGs, including our priority, the European Green Deal. But the COVID pandemic has also demonstrated a global solidarity and the need to address global challenges at the multilateral level. The Commission recently issued a paper setting a strategic vision for our multilateral engagement. This sets out how we will renew our partnership with multilateral organizations. We will focus on our strategic priorities and build an alliances with like-minded partners, confirming the SDGs as the guiding framework. We strive for stronger, more inclusive partnerships with key actors such as civil society, the private sector, youth, and multilateral organizations. Second, I am working to make the call for a global recovery initiative a reality at the multilateral level by linking debt relief and investment to SDGs. We will need to go beyond the traditional development assistance if we really want to achieve the SDGs. Our own resources alone are unfortunately not enough. So we need to use them wisely. For example, we promote private investment in infrastructure and service delivery in Africa by reducing risk and creating conducive investment environments. We support partner governments in mobilizing resources, public and private, and we are also engaging in global discussions to provide debt relief to the poorest countries. My third point is the Team Europe. The EU, its member states, and the European financial institutions pooled resources together in an unprecedented way, committing 40 billion euros as COVID-19 response in partner countries. According to the latest figure from OECD, I am proud to announce that Team Europe has increased its contribution of official development assistance by 15%, compared to last year. It brings us to 0.50% of collective gross national income. And this is crucial at the time of major health, economic, and social challenges linked to the COVID-19 crisis. Team Europe does not end with the COVID-19 response. We have launched our programming exercise 80 billion euros, 80 billion euros over 7 years. We now have strategic discussions with our partner countries and other development partners to define our programs and actions as guided by the SDGs. We are also working on nearly 150 strategic Team Europe initiatives across the world. We focus on key priorities such as green recovery, human development, growth and jobs, which directly supports the implementation of the SDGs in our partner countries. So what about future? To me, we need to rethink the COVID-19 recovery as an SDG recovery. Pandemic has shown how all challenges are closely interlinked and how the precondition for resilience is sustainability. We need to be more analytical with our friends at the SDGs at assessing the impact of the past 18 months on implementation of the various SDGs in countries, regions, and also globally. Governments need to frame their recovery plans based on this analysis, looking at major gaps and challenges. We will promote this approach across all our partnerships. Finally, I want to say a word about youth and young people. The SDGs are our shared global blueprint. And this is why I want young people in Europe and in our partner countries to help us to decide what the EU's overall aims and strategy should be, and help us in implementing our international action. And this is why I have launched youth sounding boards in our partner countries. We have called the SDGs the future we want, but for the youth, it is the future we are. This is right now the responsibility of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. That compass, as you put it, for charting the sustainable path out of the crisis, and very much echoing there what the Queen of the Belgians was also saying about this is a moment of opportunity. Yes, it's a moment of real challenge, but you're both seeing this as a moment, as you put it, to rethink that recovery and make it an SDG recovery. I'd like to come back on that in our discussion a little bit later, if we might, and whether you see any tensions, any trade-offs, or really how do we make sure this is a win-win on both sides of that equation. But let's bring in Guillaume Lafortune now for your opening thoughts before we launch our discussion. Guillaume, over to you.
Your Majesty, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today, and I'd like to thank the European Policy Center for organizing such an important and timely event today on the SDGs. I'm the director of the Paris office of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network of researchers and scientists that was set up in 2012 by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time to mobilize research and science for the Sustainable Development Goals. I haven't consulted with Madam Commissioner before the meeting, but I also would like to make 3 points in this introductory remarks. The first one is in the short run, COVID-19 is clearly a setback for sustainable development everywhere. And we need global partnership and international solidarity to make sure that the pace of recovery doesn't become unequal, because this is also a risk. We've all been hit by COVID, but there's a real risk that the pace of recovery diverges between countries that have access to vaccines, countries that have access to international financing, and those that may not have access to both vaccines and financing. COVID-19 is a setback, and we do every year in SDSN a assessment of how all UN member states are performing on the Sustainable Development Goals. And this year, for the first time, my next report will come out in June. It will be the first time since the adoption of the SDGs that we will see a decline overall in the world average on the SDG index. We start having the data coming in for 2020, including the increase in poverty rates, but also the increase in unemployment rates. And we also know that life expectancy has been hit all over the world, including according to the latest Eurostat data. And as it was mentioned by Her Majesty and Commissioner, the most vulnerable groups and countries have been hit particularly hard. So again, in this context, global access to vaccines and to financing, including through debt relief, official development assistance, and other mechanisms is absolutely crucial. The second message I'd like to emphasize, and I think it goes very well with the points that were raised by Her Majesty and Commissioner before, is that this can also be an opportunity to accelerate SDG transformations. I do think through this crisis, we realized that we can be hit by shocks like pandemics. And I'd like to mention, because the SDGs have been attacked during this pandemic, that SDG 3 does cover the issue of preparing for global health security issues and setting up early warning mechanisms as well. So this was covered in the agenda. But I think beyond even the risk of pandemics, there's this overall sentiment that the next global crisis might be related to climate, might be related to biodiversity threats, might be related to cyber security or other forms of critical risk, which are covered by the SDGs. Again, this is an agenda which took time to be adopted after tough negotiations, and it's the only instrument that we have internationally that really cuts across climate, nature, social aspects, and other important aspects that cover sustainable development, inclusive, and economic development. So let me end, and my third point will be in a context where we hear a lot of bad news. I'd like to end with a couple of good news, and I think recently there's been three good news that should give us hope for the future. The first one is the fact that we do have vaccines and that the vaccines are effective. And I think a precondition for making progress on the SDGs is to suppress this pandemic globally through the massive rollout of vaccine and the continuation of the non-pharmaceutical intervention. And I think the fact that Greta Thunberg announced yesterday that she will support COVAX is like a symbol of this connection between the climate agenda, but also with this need to suppress this pandemic. So that's the first good news. The second one, I think that 2020 was the year of the pandemic. It was also a year where many governments committed to quite bold ambitions when it comes to climate actions and achieving net zero emissions by mid-century or 2060 for China. And we have now, obviously, Europe with the European Green Deal was the first one to pull out this plan, which was followed by South Korea, Canada, Japan, and others. And in a year where we will have many international events, I think this can provide a real momentum for accelerated actions. And I'm thinking about the Climate Cup, the CBD Cup, for instance. And I think the third very good news recently is this announcement made by Biden's administration on achieving a global minimum corporate tax rate to hit profits in tax haven, but also those generated by tech companies, which have been to a large extent the big winners. And as it was mentioned by Commissioner, we will need to mobilize additional resources for this agenda. And I think this idea of a global minimum corporate tax rate really goes in the right direction. So just to conclude, I'd just like to, there's one citation which I think, really supports this SDG agenda. It's by Kennedy, which I think is a very timely one. He said in 1963, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And I really think this is the strength of those SDGs, to set the right vision, the right goals to recover stronger from this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Guillaume, and thank you for that uplifting and positive message about where we are, because we do tend, as you say, to focus on where the challenges are, and we need to if we are to seize the opportunity, but it is good to hear the other side of the coin. Your Majesty, if I could come back to you just first of all, in terms of your role as an advocate for the SDGs, you very eloquently spelled out to us in your opening remarks why they matter so much and how important they were to connect the dots and so on. But what do you see your role as an advocate for the SDGs as being?
The UN Secretary General, Mr. Gutierrez, has asked the advocates to amplify the UN messages on the state of implementation of the SDGs and the urgent need for progress. And in practice, it means that relaying these messages to a variety of audiences like today, also both in Belgium and abroad. I also find it very important to meet and discuss these issues with young people and students, what I will do also next week at the UCL, where the people that will be concerned most by the changes we need to bring about.
And in terms of your own work, I mean, you said all the SDGs are important, they're all urgent, they all need equal attention. But in your own work as an advocate, do you focus on specific ones and why?
Yes, certainly. But as I mentioned in my address before, the SDGs are all important and they are all interdependent. And we should not lose sight of this. In my capacity as an SDG advocate, one of my priorities is SDG 4, it's quality education. This is an area where much progress has been achieved, but gaps remain huge between developed and developing countries, between girls and boys. And as I said, the situation has deteriorated further because of the COVID pandemic. It will be difficult to make progress on the other SDGs if people do not get the education to have, to be a citizen, a full citizen. So education for the SDG and education for citizenship are also important in this regard. But mental health and well-being, part of the SDG 3, is also for me a priority. It is a subject that has received too little attention so far. And in many countries, there is still a stigma attached to the psychological problems and therefore a lack of access to counseling and care. And the COVID pandemic has at last made it possible to discuss these issues frankly and openly. And we should make sure that this change becomes permanent.
Thank you very much. And there, as you say, highlighting two areas where the COVID pandemic has particularly hit: education in terms of lockdowns and that inevitable, therefore, denial of access, and also the digital divide, the problems that has created. And as you say, mental health and well-being, so important always, but particularly at a time like this. Thank you very much. I'll come back to you a little later, if I might, Your Majesty. But Commissioner, just linking to that, and this importance of awareness raising, this role played by the advocates. And you talked about rethinking the COVID recovery as an SDG recovery. Do you think there needs to be, if you like, a sort of a public awareness campaign so that people understand that the two things need to go hand in hand and there's not a tension between them? Do you see an important mission now for people like yourself to get that message across?
Yes, definitely. I see an important role also for the national politicians, because now we all know that they are, preparing their national recovery plans. And I think, as I said in my introduction, I think it's very, very important that those plans are linked to the SDGs. So definitely we need to have a public debate on that. And we also need to inform the citizens about the necessity of the SDGs. And I think, at least my impression is that the COVID-19 crisis has been like an X-ray that, it has proved to the citizens also that how interlinked the world is, and, what happens in China, in the market, really affects the whole world and all of us. But if you allow me, Jacki, I would like to very shortly and briefly comment Her Majesty, because I'm very delighted that she highlighted the importance of education and SDG 4. As a former teacher, I definitely share her assessment, and that's why I have decided to increase our external funding to education in our partner countries. We know that over 1 billion pupils were out of school because of the COVID-19 crisis last year. And permanently, around 200 million students and pupils are out of school. So I think that's necessary to increase funding to education, and especially quality education. And in the previous MFF, we used approximately 7% of our external funding to education. And I have decided to increase that to be at least 10%. So I really hope that we are able to provide access to education to many young, especially young girls, but also young boys in Africa and elsewhere.
And you emphasized more broadly that question of the role of youth. They are our future, and your focus that you are putting there. Guillaume, for you, in terms of public awareness, again, very struck there, the Commissioner suggesting actually, as with everything else, yes, it's a challenge because we face so many challenges to recover from COVID, but also an opportunity because the world, people have seen how interdependent we are. Would you agree with that? Do you see this as a real moment of opportunity in terms of the public debate, as well as in terms of some of the concrete actions, or do you see a challenge there?
No, absolutely. I would echo what was said by Her Majesty and Commissioner as well. And on the role of education, I think, if anything, this should lead to an acceleration of achieving universal access to basic education, which is, again, the SDG objective. But also, I would say, and we've seen it during the pandemic, even in Europe, between those that have access or not access to digital devices and technologies. And I think it should lead to an acceleration also of the rollout and universal access to digital technology, which are imperfect, but still better than having nothing, and can help in these kinds of situation, maintaining access to schools and education. But on the public debate, I think absolutely. I mean, this agenda requires social legitimacy. And in order to achieve this, you need to get stakeholder engagement. And there's good examples in Europe on this. There's the question of consulting. There's also the question of how the results of the consultations are integrating within the plans and the policies. So they should also be followed up, obviously, by actions, but social legitimacy is absolutely necessary. And this is indeed a moment while we are developing those recovery plans, including as part of the RRF plans, to consult with the citizen, but also to involve the research and science, which can bring, as we have seen with the vaccines, some of the solutions to some of the challenges that we are facing.
And Commissioner, just to come back in terms of, you talked about the role of the national recovery plans and so on, and you take what you call a whole of government approach, and this partnership, this stakeholder engagement is part of that. What does that mean, and what does real alignment, do you believe, between policies with the SDGs? I mean, the EU, you talked about it earlier, has worked very hard to align your policies with the SDGs throughout, as you said. What is the key, do you think, as at national level, people try to do this as well? What's the key to getting that right and turning it from something that happens on paper to something that really actually happens in practice?
It's exactly like you said, Jacki, that if we look at the policy priorities for the EU and the current Commission, like Green Deal, for instance, but also digitalization and human development, resilience, and so forth, of course, they are very much linked to the SDGs. And what we are doing now, I was a bit referring to that also in my introduction, we are having a dialogue at the country level with our partner countries' governments, because we are working in a 7-year cycle in the EU, as you know very well, and now we are in the beginning of a new cycle, a financial cycle. So we started this programming exercise, which means that now we are looking how to allocate, how to direct our funding to different policy areas, but also to different regions and countries. And I'm very proud that we are doing this exercise in a bit different way, so that we are doing that together with our member states, but also with the European financial institutions. We call this approach as Team Europe. So together with our member states and the financial institutions, we are identifying at the country level that, you know, what are the flagship programs, what are the policy areas we could work together, and how to coordinate our efforts and also pool our financial resources. And of course, those flagship programs are very much linked to the SDGs. So SDGs are in a way the policy framework for the whole cooperation and partnership we are planning for our partner countries for the next 7 years. So I have to say that SDGs are part of my agenda and my teams and my DG's agenda every day, because in a way it's the essence, it's the substance of our daily work.
And Guillaume, as you look across the globe, would you say that is true broadly? How do you think other parts of the world are doing in terms of truly incorporating them and truly aligning their policies? Or do we face some challenges here and lessons we can learn from each other in how to do this best?
Yeah, so I mean, in SDSN, what we do every year is to track outcomes, so how countries are doing on the SDGs. But we also look, and we also do a survey with our experts in our networks to look at the commitments. So whether there's, you know, speeches for the SDGs, whether the SDGs are mentioned in the budget, whether there's coordination units for the SDGs, whether there's monitoring mechanisms also to track at the national level also the implementation of the goals. And here we do see, you know, overall some commitments and the SDGs being mentioned in the narrative. It's true that we see a little bit less kind of hard integration of the SDGs within, let's say, budget lines, for instance. And even in recovery plans and packages, the SDGs are quite often mentioned in the overall narrative, but a bit less as the key pillar to support those plans. We also see, I mean, I think it's very good to see those increased commitments when it comes to achieving net zero emissions. Now, when we look at what's happening in practice, I think organizations like the Climate Action Tracker or even the Energy Policy Tracker, who are looking, for instance, at the instance to which there is subsidies, unconditional subsidies to fossil fuel as part of the recovery packages, sometimes there's a little bit of a gap between the commitments and what's actually happening in practice. So I think it's very good to have, you know, we need more of those trackers to keep track of what's happening in terms of the actual policies, the subsidies, in addition to looking to the actual commitments that are being made.
And that's true, isn't it, Commissioner? I mean, the monitoring, and I know it's something that the Commission sets great store by, is committed to doing. Monitoring, reporting is absolutely essential to make sure that we don't just talk the talk, but we do genuinely walk the walk. Do you think there is more the EU can do to help your partners also develop the monitoring mechanisms that are needed?
Definitely, and I fully agree that we need to monitor. We need to be able to tell also to our citizens that what we are doing with that, with their money, because you have to remember that when EU is, using money or funding something or financing something, we are always using the taxpayers' money. And as a former finance minister, I also request that we need to be able to see also the achievements and results. So I think also from that perspective, the monitoring is definitely important. But Jacki, I would like to raise one aspect which actually was in the beginning of our conversation, but I think it's the one of the most important thing, and it's the financing. Because of the setback caused by the COVID-19, that's the fact that if we really want to achieve those sustainable development goals by the 2030, I mean, the financing gap has only increased because of the COVID-19. So we need more financing. And I think that's the reason why the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proposed this Global Recovery Initiative, so that we really need to link debt restructuring, which is now the high topic in the financial forums, but also private investments to the SDGs. And I really, the European Union has been a great advocate of this, of course, and but it's not enough, because we need the whole international community to commit this approach, and I really hope that also the private sector is very willing and also ready to be part of this approach, because otherwise we won't, be able to reach those goals in 10 years.
And talking about the business community, there's a question from our audience, from Peter Salling, who says, how can the SDGs that were developed for states be transferred to business-related and business-supporting activities? So that relationship between what the public sector does, Guillaume, and what the private sector does. Maybe a comment to that from you or the Commissioner?
No, absolutely. I mean, the private sector is absolutely key as one of the main employers and driver of economic growth, and also as a provider of solutions as well. So no, there's a lot of work that we are doing also in SDSN, but I'm thinking also about the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, for instance, the World Benchmarking Alliance, and so on. So there's a lot of initiatives that are ongoing regarding the role of the private sector. But if I may, I just wanted to go back to the EU situation, because we do also some regional assessment, and we released in December a report specifically for the EU. And one of the messages that we have in there was to say that I think we need to commend the EU for the efforts that the EU did before this agenda was agreed before 2015, then to put forward the first net zero ambition plan with the European Green Deal. And the current president of the Commission came very strongly on the SDGs from the very beginning of her mandate. And we see some of this SDG focus coming in now with initiatives that are completely ahead of the game. And I want to mention here, for instance, the current discussions around the carbon adjustment mechanisms, for instance, or on the taxonomy for sustainable investment, where the rest of the world is looking at the EU, at what the EU is able to bring to the table. But when it comes to the challenges for the EU, we see three challenges for the EU right now as part of this agenda. The first one, which is probably the most difficult one, is how to implement in a coordinated way such a complex agenda, and coordinated way in terms of across the sectors and the various goals, but also across the member countries. And we know that the energy transformation will require further integration, including of the energy grids and so on. And here the European semester is an absolutely key process in this. The two other challenges that we identify were the following. I think the second one is, and to come back to the issue of financing, the magnitude of investment. Obviously, the new MFF, Next Gen EU, provide a historical budget, 1.8 trillion over 7 years. Now, when we look on the other side of the Atlantic at what the US is doing, I mean, this is another level of investment between the 1.9 trillion and the coming 2 trillion plan. And the third challenge, just to conclude on this for us, is the issue related to international spillovers and those impacts generated through supply chains and trade that can undermine other countries' ability to achieve the goals.
Thank you very much. And Commissioner, coming back on that point about business and how to translate the SDGs, if you like, from what happens at the governmental level into the business level. And Guillaume there saying, the EU doing a lot in terms of the sort of tools like the taxonomy that can really help to make that happen. How do you see that? And just on this point about implementing in a coordinated way this complex agenda, Her Majesty talked at the beginning about how important the SDGs were to connect the dots, to bring all of this together. As we look forward, and the challenge and the agenda is more complicated than ever now, thanks to COVID, what's the key there? So the business point first, and then where we go from here.
Of course, I mean, I think we need to admit that sustainable development goals, it was a kind of a intergovernmental approach, because there were the governments who were able to agree on the Agenda 2030. But I think as we also highlighted in our new communication on multilateralism, it's not enough. It's not enough to have this intergovernmental approach. We need to have inclusive multilateralism, which means that we also need to engage with the private sector, but also with the civil society organizations. And for me, it also echoes in SDGs, that if we really want to implement that agenda, so we really need to engage not only with the governments, but we also need to engage with the civil society organizations at the country level, and also with the business societies and business and private sector. And when I have been talking to the CEOs and representatives from the private sector, I also see a huge appetite there, because from their perspective, of course, these investments now, for instance, the Green Deal or digitalization, they offers a huge opportunities. So and that was one of the messages, for instance, in our new Africa strategy, which we adopted 1 year ago, that we want to really have this equal partnership with Africa, which is benefiting the both continents. And so I personally, I'm quite confident that this Agenda 2030 is not only agenda for the governments, it's also definitely agenda for the whole society. So what are the next steps? I think, of course, everybody is now focusing on the vaccines, because vaccines are the exit strategy of the current crisis. And as you know, the European Union has showed a great solidarity and leadership in our global response. We have funded 2.2 billion euros to COVAX facility, which has already, by the way, delivered 41 million doses of vaccines to 140 countries. So I think it's also important to raise this aspect when we are talking about EU's leadership and the role in the fight against COVID-19. So now everybody is focusing on that, but parallel to that, I think it's important to focus more on recovery. And as I said earlier, from my perspective, the key issue is that how are we able to fund the recovery, which is linked to the SDGs. And here, of course, we know that US is doing a maximum effort, but also, as it was said, the European Union itself is putting a lot of financial resources through this Next Generation EU. But that's not enough. We also need to take care of the developing world.
Absolutely. Just one quick question to you from Laura Rayner. To what degree are the SDGs and the European Pillar of Social Rights being looked at simultaneously in the Commission? Considering overlaps, is there a coordinated effort to implement both? I pick up on that because if we look to the future, of course, we have a social summit coming up in Porto in May, very much the focus there on implementing the pillar. How do you see the relationship? We've talked about joined up thinking and coherence between those two things.
There is a strong link, and I really I agreed with the previous speakers referring to the European semester. I think that's in a way the key modality to really also implement and coordinate the measures at the national level. And as you know, the Commission has been very active on the social pillars. There has been a minimum wage and plenty of, child guarantee and so forth, plenty of different kind of initiatives. But also in the external action, we have decided to use 20% of our external funding to human development. And I think it's very much needed, not only because of the COVID-19, because of the healthcare and needs there, but also because of the social protection. So, so there is a very, very strong commitment to that part as well.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question from Rita Jewell, and Guillaume, perhaps you could pick up on this one. Should the international community add another goal on risk and pandemics and how to collectively deal with their devastating impacts, knowing that the future risk, says the questioner, for more pandemics has been confirmed by scientists? Is it enough we have SDG 3 on good health and well-being? Do we, in light of what's happened, need another goal, or merely to look at SDG 3 in a slightly different way, perhaps in the future?
Yeah, so three points to that. First of all, to remind everyone that SDG 3 does cover the issue of global health security. The exact SDG is SDG 3.D, which calls all countries to strengthen preparedness for global health security events and early warning mechanisms. Now, one of the issues here is that we do not have good international measurements of how well countries are prepared for facing these types of events. I mean, we've done an exercise in SDSN to correlate the pre-COVID-19 measures of preparedness with measures of COVID outcome, and there's no relationship here between how well you were perceived to be prepared and your actual COVID-19 outcome. So that's the first thing. On adding another goal, I think this was something that came out during COVID, the need to change the goals, to scale back ambition, maybe to reshape the goals. I think we have to remember that this was a very tough negotiation process. And I'm not sure if going back at the negotiation table
would be productive necessarily.
Exactly.
Indeed.
And just one final point, Jacki,
Yep.
on the role of science, because I think, the question points to that. I think, as it was mentioned by in the question, science did predict that this would happen. Science is bringing some of the solutions for this pandemic, and so research and science should also be mobilized as we're thinking about those long-term plans and strategies for achieving the goals in order to inform those plans.
Thank you. And a very unfair last question. Of all the things we've talked about, and I do want to come back to Her Majesty before the end, but Guillaume and then the Commissioner, and then I'll come back to Her Majesty. Of all the things we've talked about, if we are to seize this moment that you've all talked about, if we are to truly make this the decade for action and delivery, and really make sure that not only do we reverse what we have lost through COVID, but we really accelerate that transition. What for you, if you had to identify maybe one key next step, the most important thing we need to do now, and very briefly, 1 minute each or so, Guillaume, what's the key thing we need to do now from your point of view?
Very briefly, and I'll focus on the short run. Global access to vaccines, the health case, the economic cases are very clear. And then, as it was emphasized by a commissioner, also access to financing for those low-income countries, vulnerable countries that do not have the same level of access to financing as we have in advanced economies.
Thank you. So both points, Commissioner, you already made. Is there anything you would add, or something in terms of a key next step in either of those areas that you think we need to focus on first?
Well, I fully agree that we need to have an exit strategy of this current crisis, and that's the vaccines. And we have a good start, but unfortunately, that's not enough. So none of us is safe until all of us is safe, and that means that all of us need to be vaccinated. So of course, we are working very hard on that, and that's the priority number one at the moment.
Thank you very much. And Your Majesty, before we close, you've been listening to the discussion between the Commissioner and Guillaume. Your thoughts and reflections on where we go from here?
I believe our conversation has underlined two things. On the one hand, the importance of a holistic approach. Of course, we need to activate separate tracks in order to move on. But a genuine implementation of the SDGs means, as I said, a change of mindset. rethinking values, changing education, mobilizing young people and new stakeholders, and understanding better the consequences of our choices. Secondly, the future is not a fixed deadline. As we adapt or fail to do so, it will look different. We need to keep track of progress, definitely, but also of what really works and what does not. We should have the capacity to plan and to change course in due time and no longer wait until it is too late to react.
Thank you very much indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that the SDGs matter more than they ever did. It is also clear that we face huge challenges to get there. But on the other hand, I'm also struck by some of the optimism that you all have, that this is a moment of opportunity and it is a moment that we are ready to seize, we are able to seize if we have that mindset that Her Majesty just referred to in order to do it. So thank you very much to you all, and particularly thank you, Your Majesty, for being with us this afternoon and for your advocacy work. Commissioner, thank you so much. Guillaume, great to have you with us too. And thank you to all of you. Many, many hundreds of people joined this conversation this afternoon, which shows just how important this issue is. Thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you for your questions. I only managed to squeeze 2 or 3 in, but at least we managed to put a couple of them to our panel. Only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant evening and do stay safe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.